The scorching July heat pressed down on the Texas state capitol like a heavy blanket. But inside the air-conditioned confines of the governor's office, Greg Abbott sat reviewing the latest polling, numbers with a steady focus that had defined his political career for over 3 decades. The morning sun cast long shadows across his mahogany desk, illuminating a framed photo of him with his wife Cecilia and their daughter Audrey, alongside a well-worn Bible that had been his constant companion since his days as a young attorney. "Governor, we've got the Education Committee meeting in 15 minutes, his chief of staff, Maria Gonzalez, announced as she entered the office with a stack of briefing papers. A native Texan with roots tracing back to the state's earliest settlers, Maria had been with Abbott since his attorney general days. Understanding his vision better than most, Abbott nodded, his weathered hands adjusting his position in the wheelchair with practiced efficiency. At 65, his silver hair and lined face told the story of decades spent fighting for what he believed were the fundamental principles that made Texas and America great. "What's the latest on the prayer initiative?" "Strong support from rural districts as expected. Some pushback from the urban areas, but that's nothing new," Maria replied, her slight drawl reflecting her East Texas upbringing. "The teachers' union is mobilizing, but our base is solid." Abbott's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the calculating precision of a man who had learned to turn every obstacle into an opportunity. "They don't understand what we're fighting for, Maria. This isn't about politics, it's about preserving the very soul of our nation." The initiative in question was Abbott's latest push to restore voluntary prayer in Texas public schools, a cornerstone of his broader vision that faith-based values were essential to American society. Critics called it a violation of church-state separation, but Abbott saw it as returning to the country's founding principles. "Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue." "Sir, if I may," Maria said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "The media's gonna paint this as another culture war battle. How do we frame this differently?" Abbott leaned back, his mind drifting to a conversation he'd had with his father decades earlier, back when he was still walking and still uncertain about his path in life. His father, a simple man who worked in insurance but possessed profound wisdom about life and values, had told him, "Son, a nation without God is like a tree without roots. It might stand for a while, but the first strong wind will knock it down." "We frame it as what it is," Abbott said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him one of the most influential governors in Texas history. "We're not imposing religion on anyone. We're giving our children the opportunity to connect with something greater than themselves, to understand that their rights come from God, not from government." The intercom buzzed, and Abbott's secretary announced that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick had arrived for their pre-meeting discussion. Patrick, a former radio host turned politician, shared Abbott's conservative vision and had been instrumental in pushing through many of the governor's key initiatives. "Send him in, Sarah," Abbott replied, then turned to Maria. "Get me the latest numbers on homeschooling rates in Texas. I want to see if there's a correlation between our education policies and family choices." Patrick entered with his characteristic energy, his tall frame and silver hair making him look every bit the former broadcaster he was. "Governor, we've got momentum on this prayer initiative. The folks back home are fired up about it." "That's what I like to hear, Dan," Abbott said, gesturing toward the seating area near the windows overlooking the Capitol grounds. "But we need to be strategic about this. The national media is going to try to make us look like extremists." Patrick settled into one of the leather chairs, his expression serious. "Greg, you know as well as I do that they're gonna attack us no matter what we do. The question is whether we're gonna stand firm on our principles or cave to pressure." Abbott nodded, remembering the countless battles he'd fought over the years from his time as Attorney General, challenging federal overreach to his current role as governor defending Texas values. against what he saw as an increasingly hostile federal government. Each fight had taught him something about the nature of political courage and the importance of unwavering conviction. "I've been thinking about something my granddaddy used to say," Abbott began, his voice taking on the reflective tone that often preceded his most important decisions. "He told me that a man's character isn't measured by how he acts when everyone's watching and agreeing with him. It's measured by how he stands when he's alone and the whole world seems to be against him." The morning sun had shifted, now streaming directly through the windows and illuminating the Texas flag that stood proudly in the corner of the office. Abbott looked at it for a moment, thinking about all the men and women who had fought and died for the principles it represented. "Dan, I want you to know that this prayer initiative isn't just about education policy. It's about whether we're going to let this country forget where its blessings came from. Every great civilization in history has fallen when it abandoned the moral foundation that made it great in the first place." Patrick leaned forward, his broadcaster's instincts picking up on the deeper meaning behind Abbott's words. "You're talking about more than just prayer in schools, aren't you?" "I'm talking about the survival of the American experiment," Abbott replied, his voice carrying the weight of his deepest convictions. "For too long, we've been told that faith and government don't mix, that religion is a private matter with no place in public life. But that's not what the founders believed, and it's not what built this great nation." As the two men prepared to head to the Education Committee meeting, Abbott reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From his days as a young judge to his tenure as attorney general, and now as governor, he had always believed that his role was not just to govern, but to preserve and protect the values that made Texas and America exceptional. The accident that had left him paralyzed at 26 could have broken him, but instead it had strengthened his resolve and deepened his faith. He had learned that true strength came not from physical ability, but from moral conviction and the willingness to stand for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The committee room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds spilling into the hallway and dozens of protesters gathered outside the Capitol building. Abbott entered the room with his characteristic calm demeanor, but those who knew him well could see the steel in his eyes, the same determination that had carried him through his darkest personal moments and his most challenging political battles. The Education Committee was a microcosm of Texas politics itself, passionate advocates on both sides, deeply held beliefs, and the kind of fundamental disagreements that had defined American discourse for generations. Abbott took his place at the witness table, flanked by several prominent Texas pastors and education advocates who supported the prayer initiative. Committee Chairman Robert Martinez, a veteran legislator from San Antonio, called the hearing to order with a gravity that reflected the significance of the moment. "We're here today to discuss House Bill 1776, which would provide guidelines for voluntary prayer and moment of silence in Texas public schools. Governor Abbott, the floor is yours." Abbott adjusted his microphone and surveyed the room, taking in the faces of supporters and opponents alike. In the front row, he spotted Jonna Richardson, a middle school teacher from Houston who had been one of the most vocal critics of the initiative. Her presence reminded him that this wasn't just about policy, it was about real people with real concerns about their children's futures. "Chairman Martinez, committee members, fellow Texans," Abbott began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I wanted to start by acknowledging that we're discussing something that touches the very heart of who we are as Americans and as Texans. This is not a casual conversation about administrative policy. This is about the soul of our state and our nation." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. 40 years ago, prayer was as common in American schools as the Pledge of Allegiance. Our children began each day with a moment of reflection, an acknowledgement that there was something greater than themselves that deserved their respect and gratitude. But somewhere along the way, we lost that. We decided that faith was somehow dangerous to democracy, that acknowledging God was somehow harmful to our children. A murmur ran through the crowd, approval from some, discontent from others. Abbott had expected this reaction and was prepared for it. "Now, I want to be crystal clear about something," he continued. his voice taking on the firm tone that had made him such an effective communicator. This initiative does not, I repeat, does not force any child to pray. It does not favor any particular religion. It simply provides an opportunity for those who choose to do so to begin their day with a moment of reflection and gratitude. Jana Richardson raised her hand, and Chairman Martinez recognized her. Governor Abbott, with all due respect, how do we ensure that children who choose not to participate aren't singled out or made to feel uncomfortable? How do we protect the rights of families who come from different faith traditions or no faith tradition at all? Abbott nodded, appreciating the thoughtful nature of the question. Mrs. Richardson, that's exactly the kind of concern that shows why we need clear guidelines and careful implementation. No child should ever be made to feel like an outsider because of their family's beliefs or lack thereof. This is about inclusion, not exclusion. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. But I'd like to ask you something in return. Why have we become so afraid of acknowledging that the vast majority of Texans and Americans believe in God? Why have we decided that the majority should hide their faith to protect the minority, rather than finding ways to respect both? The question hung in the air for a moment before Richardson responded. Governor, it's not about hiding faith. It's about ensuring that public institutions remain neutral so that all citizens feel equally represented and protected. But that's where I respectfully disagree, Abbott replied. True neutrality would acknowledge that faith has been part of American public life since the founding of our nation. What we call neutrality today is actually hostility toward religion. We've gone from Congress shall make no law, respecting an establishment of religion, to Congress shall make no law, acknowledging that religion exists. Pastor David Wilson from First Baptist Church of Dallas stood up in the gallery. Governor, can you speak to the impact you believe this initiative will have on our children's character development? Abbott's expression softened as he considered the question. Pastor Wilson, I think about my own daughter and the challenges she faces growing up in a world that often seems to have lost its moral compass. When I was young, children understood that there were absolute standards of right and wrong, that their actions had consequences not just in this world but in the next. That foundation gave them strength to make difficult choices and to stand up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. He paused, his mind drifting to his own childhood and the strong moral foundation his parents had provided. Today, our children are told that truth is relative, that right and wrong are matters of personal opinion, that they are essentially highly evolved animals with no purpose beyond their own pleasure and survival. Is it any wonder that we're seeing increases in youth depression, anxiety, and destructive behavior? Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychology professor from the University of Texas, stood to speak. Governor Abbott, while I understand your concerns about youth mental health, research shows that well-being is more closely correlated with strong family relationships, community support, and economic stability than with religious observance. Are we perhaps looking for a simple solution to complex problems? Abbott smiled slightly, recognizing an intelligent challenge when he heard one. Dr. Chen, I appreciate your academic perspective, and I don't disagree that family relationships and community support are crucial. But I'd argue that faith strengthens, rather than weakens these bonds, when families pray together, when communities gather in worship, when individuals understand themselves as part of something greater than their own immediate interests. These things create the foundation for the strong relationships and stable communities you're describing. The hearing continued for another hour, with passionate testimony from both sides. Abbott listened carefully to each speaker, responding thoughtfully to questions and challenges while never wavering from his core message, that acknowledging God in public life was not about imposing beliefs, but about recognizing the source of America's strength and greatness. As the session concluded, Abbott found himself thinking about a conversation he had with his wife Cecilia the night before. She had expressed concern about the political risks of pushing such a controversial initiative, worrying that it might hurt his standing with moderate voters or damage his future political prospects. Cecilia, he had told her, if we're only willing to fight for popular causes, then we're not really fighting for anything at all. The easy battles have already been won. The hard ones, the ones that really matter, those are the ones that test whether we truly believe what we claim to believe. Now, as he prepared to leave the committee room, Abbott felt the weight of that conviction more than ever. He knew that the prayer initiative was just the beginning of a larger battle for the soul of America, but he also knew that it was a battle worth fighting, regardless of the personal or political cost. The backlash came swiftly and predictably. Within hours of the committee hearing, Abbott's office was flooded with calls from national media outlets, civil rights organizations, and political opponents who saw an opportunity to paint him as an extremist. The governor's press secretary, Tommy Martinez, knocked on Abbott's door at 6 a.m. the next morning with a stack of newspapers and a grim expression. "Governor, you need to see this," Tommy said, spreading the papers across Abbott's desk. The headlines ranged from critical to outright hostile. Abbott's theocracy push. Texas governor wants to force religion on students, and The Handmaid's Tale comes to Texas. Abbott scanned the articles with practiced calm, his years in politics having taught him to weather media storms with patience and strategic thinking. "What are we hearing from our base?" he asked. "Mixed," Tommy replied honestly. "The hardcore supporters are fired up and ready to fight. The moderates are nervous about the national attention, and the business community is worried about potential boycotts." Abbott nodded, understanding the delicate balance he had to maintain. Texas was a red state, but it was also home to major corporations and diverse urban centers that didn't always align with conservative social policies. The challenge was advancing his vision while maintaining the broad coalition that had made him successful. His phone buzzed with a text from his old friend and political mentor, former Governor Rick Perry. "Stay strong, brother. The media storm will pass, but principles are forever." At 8 a.m., Abbott met with his senior staff in the conference room adjacent to his office. The team included Maria Gonzalez, Press Secretary Tommy Martinez, Policy Director Jennifer Walsh, and political strategist Mike Harrison. Each brought a different perspective to the challenges they were facing. "All right, folks," Abbott began, his voice steady and focused. "I know the national media is having a field day with this, but I want everyone to remember something. We're not here to win popularity contests. We're here to do what's right for Texas and for America." Jennifer Walsh, a former federal prosecutor who had joined Abbott's team 2 years earlier, leaned forward. "Governor, I've been reviewing the legal challenges we're likely to face. The ACLU has already announced they're preparing a lawsuit, and several other organizations are mobilizing. We need to be prepared for a prolonged legal battle. I've been in legal battles before," Abbott replied with a slight smile. "As Attorney General, I sued the federal government 44 times. If we're going to fight for our principles, we might as well fight in court too." Mike Harrison, who had managed several successful conservative campaigns across Texas, raised a concern. "Sir, my worry isn't about our base there with us. It's about the suburban voters, especially suburban women, who might see this as government overreach. We need to be careful about how we frame this." Abbott considered this carefully. Harrison was right that suburban voters had become increasingly important in Texas politics, and many of them were wary of what they perceived as mixing religion and government. But Abbott also believed that principles couldn't be compromised for political convenience. "Mike, I understand the concern, but let me ask you this: what's the point of winning elections if we're not willing to govern according to our beliefs once we're in office? If we're going to be timid about defending faith in public life, then we might as well let the Democrats run the state." The room fell silent for a moment as the team processed the governor's words. They all knew Abbott well enough to understand that once he made up his mind on a matter of principle, he was unlikely to back down regardless of the political consequences. Maria Gonzalez broke the silence. "Governor, what if we emphasize the voluntary nature of the prayer initiative? Make it clear that this is about protecting the rights of religious students, rather than imposing religion on anyone." "That's exactly what we should do," Abbott replied. "But we can't be defensive about it. We need to go on offense and explain why acknowledging God in public life is good for everyone, not just for religious people." Tommy Martinez looked up from his phone. "Sir, CNN is requesting an interview about the prayer initiative. They want to do a live segment tomorrow morning. Abbott considered this for a moment. CNN was not friendly territory for conservative politicians, but it was also an opportunity to reach a national audience and explain his position directly, rather than having it filtered through hostile media coverage. Set it up, Abbott decided, but I want to do it from here in the governor's office, with the Texas flag visible in the background. If they want to interview the governor of Texas, they can do it in Texas. As the meeting broke up, Abbott asked Maria to stay behind. He wanted to discuss the deeper strategy behind the prayer initiative and how it fit into his broader vision for Texas and America. "Maria, I need you to understand something," Abbott said once they were alone. "This prayer initiative isn't just about education policy. It's about whether we're going to let this country forget its foundation. Every great civilization in history has fallen when it abandoned the moral principles that made it great in the first place." Maria nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand, Governor, but how do we convince people who don't share our faith that this is good for them too?" Abbott leaned back in his wheelchair, his gaze drifting to the window where he could see the Texas Capitol dome gleaming in the morning. "Son, we remind them that the principles that built this country, individual liberty, personal responsibility, the dignity of every human being, these didn't come from government. They came from our understanding that we are created in the image of God and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights." He turned back to Maria, his voice taking on the passionate tone that had made him such an effective political communicator. "When we remove God from public life, we don't become neutral, we become vulnerable to every ideology that promises to fill that void. We've seen it happen in other countries, and we're seeing it happen here. Young people are being told that their highest purpose is to serve the state, to find their identity in political movements, to drive their meaning from social causes, rather than from their relationship with their Creator." Maria understood the broader implications of what Abbott was saying. The prayer initiative was part of a larger cultural battle that had been raging for decades, and Abbott saw himself as standing at a crucial moment in that battle. "What do you need from me, Governor?" she asked. "I need you to help me communicate this vision to the people of Texas and to the nation. We're not trying to impose our beliefs on anyone. We're trying to preserve the freedom for people to acknowledge and worship God as they choose. But we're also trying to remind this country that our rights and freedoms come from God, not from government, and that forgetting that truth is the first step toward tyranny." As Maria left the office, Abbott remained at his desk, reviewing his notes for the CNN interview. He knew that the next few days would be crucial in shaping public opinion about the prayer initiative and, more broadly, about his vision for America's future. The phone rang, and Abbott answered to find his daughter Audrey on the line. "Dad, I saw the news about the prayer thing. Are you okay?" Abbott smiled, his voice softening. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just fighting the good fight. I know you are, Dad. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you for standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard." As Abbott hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The criticism would continue, the legal challenges would mount, and the political pressure would intensify. But he also knew that he was fighting for something much bigger than his own political career. He was fighting for the soul of a nation. The CNN interview was scheduled for 7 a.m. Central Time, prime viewing hours for the national audience that would be watching Abbott defend his prayer initiative. The studio lights were harsh in the governor's office, but Abbott had insisted on doing the interview from Austin rather than traveling to Atlanta or New York. If the national media wanted to challenge the governor of Texas, they could do it. On Texas soil, Anderson Cooper appeared on the monitor, his expression professionally neutral, but with the hint of skepticism that Abbott had come to expect from mainstream media personalities. "Governor Abbott, thank you for joining us this morning. Let's get right to it. Critics are saying your prayer initiative is an attempt to impose Christian nationalism on Texas public schools. How do you respond to that?" Abbott had anticipated this line of attack and was ready with his response. "Anderson, that's exactly the kind of mischaracterization that shows how far we've drifted from understanding our own Constitution. This initiative doesn't impose anything on anyone. It simply acknowledges that the vast majority of Texans and Americans believe in God and want the freedom to express that belief in public life. But Governor, Cooper pressed, the First Amendment clearly establishes separation of church and state. Aren't you violating that principle? Abbott leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of a constitutional scholar rather than a politician. Anderson, I've argued more cases before the Supreme Court than most sitting justices. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It doesn't say Congress shall make no law acknowledging that religion exists. There's a profound difference between establishing a state religion and recognizing the role of faith in American life. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The phrase separation of church and state doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. It comes from a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote to reassure Baptists that the government wouldn't interfere with their religious practices. But somehow we've twisted that into meaning that religious people should be excluded from public life. That's not what the founders intended, and it's not what the Constitution requires. Cooper shifted tactics. Governor, you've been dealing with significant challenges in Texas: the energy grid, immigration, education funding. Why is prayer in schools a priority right now? Abbott's expression grew more serious. Because, Anderson, all of those challenges you mentioned are symptoms of a deeper problem. We've raised generations of young people who don't understand where their rights come from, who don't have a moral foundation to guide their decisions, who don't believe in anything greater than themselves. You can't build a strong society on that foundation. The camera caught Abbott's intensity as he continued. When I was Attorney General, I sued the federal government 44 times because I believed in the principle of limited government and state sovereignty. But limited government only works when people have internal moral restraints. When people lose their connection to God, they lose their understanding of right and wrong. And then government has to step in to control behavior that used to be self-regulated. Cooper raised an eyebrow. Are you saying non-religious people can't be moral? Not at all. Abbott replied quickly. I'm saying that a society that systematically excludes religious influence from public life is cutting itself off from the source of its own moral traditions. Every principle we hold dear: the dignity of human life, the importance of individual liberty, the concept of justice. These didn't emerge from secular philosophy. They came from centuries of religious thought and practice. Back in the governor's office, Abbott's staff watched the interview with nervous attention. Tommy Martinez took notes on potential follow-up questions from other media outlets, while Maria Gonzalez monitored social media reactions in real time. He's doing well, Jennifer Walsh observed, staying on message without sounding defensive. On screen, Cooper was asking about the political implications of the prayer initiative. Governor, some are saying this is positioning for a potential presidential run. Is this about Texas schools or national ambitions? Abbott's jaw tightened slightly, a tell that his staff recognized as a sign of controlled frustration. Anderson, I'm focused on governing Texas and fighting for the principles that made this country great. But I will say this: if we don't start taking a stand for our foundational values, there won't be a country left worth leading. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Cooper pressing on various aspects of the initiative and Abbott holding firm to his core message. When it ended, Abbott felt cautiously optimistic about how it had gone. Sir, Tommy Martinez said as the camera crews packed up, we're already getting calls from Fox News, Newsmax, and several radio shows. The base is fired up. Abbott nodded, but his attention was focused on a different concern. What are we hearing from the business community? Any major companies threatening to relocate or cancel expansions? Maria consulted her tablet. Boeing and Tesla have both issued statements saying they're monitoring the situation. HEB released a statement about supporting diversity and inclusion, but nothing dramatic yet. Abbott knew that Texas's business-friendly environment was one of his greatest political assets, and he couldn't afford to jeopardize it with social policy fights. But he also believed that a state without moral foundations wouldn't be prosperous for long. Get me a meeting with the Texas Association of Business, he instructed. I want to explain to them why this initiative is good for Texas business, not bad for it. That afternoon, Abbott met with several major donors and business leaders at the governor's mansion. The group included energy executives, real estate developers, and tech entrepreneurs who had been crucial to Abbott's political success over the years. Governor, said Bill Patterson, CEO of a major Houston-based energy company, "We support you, but we're concerned about the national attention this is getting. Our shareholders are asking questions, and our employees in other states are wondering if Texas is becoming too conservative for their tastes." Abbott appreciated Patterson's directness. "Bill, I understand your concerns, but let me ask you something. What kind of employees do you want? Do you want people who are disciplined, honest, hardworking, and committed to something greater than themselves? Or do you want people who think everything is relative and that there's no absolute standard of right and wrong?" Another business leader, Sandra Rodriguez, who ran a major tech company in Austin, raised her hand. "Governor, with respect, you're creating a false choice. There are plenty of non-religious people who are disciplined and hardworking, and there are religious people who aren't." Abbott nodded. "You're absolutely right, Sandra. But I'm not talking about individual cases, I'm talking about cultural trends. When a society loses its moral foundation, it starts to see the symptoms everywhere: declining work ethic, increasing dishonesty, breakdown of families, addiction problems, mental health crises. You can't legislate your way out of those problems. You have to address the root cause." The meeting continued for an hour, with Abbott making his case that moral renewal was essential for long-term economic prosperity. By the end, he hadn't convinced everyone, but he had given them something to think about. That evening, Abbott sat in his study at the governor's mansion, reviewing reports from his staff about the day's reactions to the CNN interview. The responses were predictably polarized: strong support from conservatives, harsh criticism from progressives, and nervousness from moderates. His wife Cecilia entered with a cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from his desk. "How are you feeling about today?" Abbott looked up from his papers, his expression thoughtful. "Like we're fighting the right battle, but it's going to be harder than I expected." "Greg," Cecilia said gently, "I know this matters to you, but I'm worried about the cost. Not just politically, but personally. You've been under enormous stress, and it's affecting your health." Abbott reached across the desk to take her hand. "Cecilia, do you remember what you told me after the accident? You said that God had a plan for my life, that the wheelchair wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter." She nodded, her eyes misting slightly at the memory. "This feels like part of that plan," Abbott continued. "Maybe I went through that accident. Maybe I learned to fight through adversity so that I could stand up for our values when it really mattered. If I back down now, what was it all for?" Cecilia squeezed his hand. "I know, and I'm proud of you for standing on your principles. I just don't want you to sacrifice your health or our family for a political fight." Abbott smiled, feeling the weight of her concern but also the strength of her support. "I promise you, I won't let this consume me. But I also can't let fear of consequences stop me from doing what I believe is right." 3 weeks after the CNN interview, Abbott faced his biggest political crisis since becoming governor. The prayer initiative had become a national lightning rod, with protests erupting in Austin, corporate boycotts threatening Texas businesses, and polls showing his approval ratings dropping among suburban voters. More concerning, several prominent Texas Republicans had begun distancing themselves from the initiative, worried about their own political futures. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Abbott received a call from Senator Ted Cruz, one of his closest allies in the conservative movement. "Greg, we need to talk. Can you meet me at the ranch this afternoon?" Abbott agreed, knowing that Cruz wouldn't request a face-to-face meeting unless the situation was serious. The ranch was a private retreat outside Austin where Texas Republican leaders often met to discuss sensitive political matters away from media attention. The drive to the ranch gave Abbott time to think about how dramatically the political landscape had shifted in just a few weeks. What had started as a straightforward education policy initiative had become a defining moment for his governorship and possibly his political future. Cruz was waiting in the ranch's main lodge, his expression unusually somber. "Greg, I'm going. To be straight with you, the establishment is getting nervous. They're worried that this prayer thing is going to cost us the suburbs in the next election cycle. Abbott poured himself a glass of water and settled into one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace. Ted, when did we start caring more about what the establishment thinks than what our voters think? That's not fair, and you know it. Cruz replied, I've fought the establishment my entire career, but I've also learned that you can't advance conservative principles if you don't win elections. And right now, this initiative is putting our electoral coalition at risk. Abbott studied his friend's face, seeing the genuine concern there. Cruz had been through his own political battles and understood the pressures of maintaining conservative principles while building winning coalitions. What are you hearing? Abbott asked. Cruz pulled out his phone and showed Abbott a series of polling numbers. Your approval rating has dropped 8 points in the suburbs. Republican women are moving away from us, and the Democrats are using this to paint all of us as extremists. Abbott reviewed the numbers with the clinical attention he had once applied to legal briefs. The data was concerning, but it wasn't unexpected. Ted, do you remember why we got into politics in the first place? Of course I do. To fight for conservative principles and limited government. And do you remember what those principles are? Based on what gives us the moral authority to advocate for limited government and individual liberty? Cruz shifted uncomfortably. Greg, I know where you're going with this, but no, hear me out. Abbott interrupted. Limited government only works when people have internal moral restraints. Individual liberty only works when people understand that their rights come with responsibilities. Personal responsibility only makes sense when people believe they're accountable to something greater than themselves. Abbott leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him such a formidable attorney general. If we abandon the foundation of our principles just to win elections, what exactly are we conserving? What's the point of winning if we're not willing to govern according to our beliefs? Cruz was quiet for a long moment, processing Abbott's argument. I don't disagree with you in principle, Greg, but I'm worried about the practical consequences. If we lose the suburbs, we lose Texas. If we lose Texas, we lose the country. And if we lose our soul, what difference does it make whether we win or lose? The two men sat in silence for a moment, both wrestling with the tension between principle and pragmatism that defined modern conservative politics. Finally, Cruz spoke. What if we found a way to modify the initiative, keep the core principle, but make it more palatable to moderate voters? Abbott shook his head. Ted, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess in the first place. We keep compromising and compromising until we stand for nothing. I'm not going to do that anymore. Then what's your plan? Because the current trajectory isn't sustainable. Abbott stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Texas landscape he had spent his life fighting to protect. My plan is to trust the people of Texas. I believe that deep down, most Texans understand what we're fighting for. They may be nervous about the controversy, but they know that faith and family are the foundation of a good society. He turned back to Cruz. I'm going to take this case directly to the people, not through the media, not through political consultants, but through town halls and church visits and community meetings. I'm going to explain why acknowledging God in public life is good for everyone, not just for religious people. Cruz looked skeptical. Greg, that's a huge political risk. If it backfires, you could lose everything. Ted, I've been thinking about something my father told me when I was young. He said that a man's character isn't measured by how he acts when everyone agrees with him. It's measured by how he stands when he's alone and the whole world seems to be against him. Abbott returned to his chair, his expression resolute. I'd rather lose fighting for what I believe in than win by abandoning my principles, and I don't think it's going to come to that. I think the people of Texas are better than the polls suggest. That evening, Abbott returned to the governor's mansion to find his senior staff waiting for him with more troubling news. Maria Gonzalez met him at the door with a stack of papers and a grim expression. Governor, we've got problems, 3 major. Corporations have announced they're reconsidering their Texas expansion plans. The Texas Association of Business is requesting another meeting, and we just got word that some House Republicans are talking about introducing a resolution to table the prayer initiative. Abbott reviewed the materials as he made his way to his study. The corporate pressure was more intense than he had expected, and the defection of Republican legislators was particularly concerning. "What's our support looking like in the legislature?" he asked. "Still solid in rural districts, but we're losing suburban Republicans," Maria replied. "The speaker is getting nervous, and Lieutenant Governor Patrick is starting to hedge his bets." Abbott nodded, understanding the political dynamics at play. Texas politics had always been about balancing different constituencies, and the prayer initiative was putting that balance under severe strain. "Sir," Tommy Martinez said, "Fox News is reporting that you're considering backing down from the initiative. They want a statement." Abbott's jaw tightened. "Get me a phone call with Tucker Carlson. I want to set the record straight." As his staff scattered to implement his instructions, Abbott remained in his study, thinking about the path forward. The political pressure was intense, but he had faced adversity before and emerged stronger. The key was to remain focused on the larger purpose while being tactical about the immediate challenges. His phone rang, and he answered to find his daughter Audrey on the line. "Dad, I saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just fighting for what I believe in." "I know you are. But Dad, can I ask you something? Why is this particular fight so important to you?" "I mean, there are lots of ways to support religious freedom without making it about schools." Abbott paused, considering how to explain his deepest convictions to his daughter. "Audrey, do you remember when you were little and used to ask me why I was in a wheelchair?" "Of course. And do you remember what I told you? That sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that God can use even the worst circumstances for good purposes." "Yes, I remember." This prayer initiative is about making sure that future generations of children understand that same truth, that there's a God who loves them, who has a plan for their lives, who can bring good out of even the most difficult circumstances. If we don't teach our children that, we're not just failing them educationally, we're failing them spiritually. Audrey was quiet for a moment. "I understand, Dad, and I'm proud of you for standing up for what you believe in. But please be careful. Don't let this fight destroy everything else you've built." After hanging up, Abbott sat in his study for a long time, thinking about his daughter's words and the weight of the decisions he was facing. The easy path would be to scale back the initiative, to find a compromise that would satisfy the moderates while maintaining some conservative support. But Abbott had learned long ago that the easy path rarely led to meaningful change. He opened his Bible to a passage he had read many times during difficult moments in his life. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Whatever the political consequences, Abbott knew he had to stay true to his convictions. The question was whether he could find a way to do so while maintaining the coalition necessary to govern effectively. The town hall in Tyler, Texas, was packed with over 800 people, representing the full spectrum of East Texas political opinion. Abbott had chosen Tyler deliberately. It was representative of the suburban-rural divide that was testing his coalition, with a mix of conservative Christians, business leaders, and moderate families who had traditionally supported Republican candidates, but were growing uncomfortable with the prayer initiative. Abbott entered the high school auditorium to a standing ovation from about half the crowd, while the other half remained seated, their expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile. He had insisted on taking unscreened questions from the audience, against the advice of his political team, because he believed that authentic dialogue was the only way to bridge the growing divide. "Good evening, East Texas," Abbott began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium. "I want to start by thanking you all for coming out tonight. I know this is a controversial issue, and I know there are folks here who disagree with me. But that's exactly why I wanted to be here, because democracy works best when we can talk to each other honestly about our differences." The first question came from Martha Stevens, a retired teacher from Longview. "Governor Abbott, I taught in public schools for 30 years, and I always tried to respect all of my students, regardless of their family's religious beliefs. How do you ensure that children from non-Christian families don't feel excluded or pressured by this prayer initiative?" Abbott nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Stevens, that's exactly the kind of question that shows why we need clear guidelines for Implementation. First, let me be crystal clear. This initiative is voluntary. No child will be required to participate. No child will be singled out for not participating. And the prayer time is not denomination specific, it's simply a moment for students who choose to pray to do so. He paused, making eye contact with Mrs. Stevens. But I want to ask you something in return. In your 30 years of teaching, did you ever have students who were struggling with difficult circumstances at home? Students who were dealing with family problems or poverty or other challenges? Mrs. Stevens nodded. Of course. And did you ever wish you could do more to help them? To give them some source of hope or strength beyond what the school system could provide? Many times, she replied. That's what this initiative is about. Abbott continued. It's not about forcing religion on anyone. It's about giving students who wanted the opportunity to connect with something greater than themselves, to find strength and hope in their faith, and to understand that their problems, whatever they are not bigger than God. The next question came from David Chen, a software engineer who had moved to Tyler from California. Governor, I'm not religious, but I respect those who are. My concern is that this initiative seems to be government endorsement of religion, which violates the constitutional principle of separation of church and state. Abbott had been expecting this question and was ready with a detailed response. Mr. Chen, I appreciate your respectful approach to this issue, but I want to challenge the premise of your question. The Constitution doesn't establish separation of church and state. It establishes that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. There's a crucial difference. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of a constitutional scholar. The founders weren't trying to create a secular society. They were trying to prevent the government from establishing a national church like England had. But they also understood that religious faith was essential to the functioning of a free society. John Adams said it best, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Abbott gestured toward the audience. Mr. Chen, you said you're not religious, but you respect those who are. Why do you think that is? What is it about religious faith that earns your respect? Chen considered the question thoughtfully. I suppose it's because religious people often seem to have a strong moral foundation and a sense of purpose beyond themselves. Exactly, Abbott replied. And that's exactly why acknowledging faith in public life is good for everyone, not just for religious people. When people have a strong moral foundation, it benefits the entire community. When people believe they're accountable to something greater than themselves, they're more likely to be honest, hardworking, and considerate of others. The questions continued for over an hour, with Abbott facing challenges from multiple directions. Some audience members wanted him to go further in promoting Christian values in schools, while others wanted him to abandon the initiative entirely. Throughout it all, Abbott maintained his core message that acknowledging God in public life was both constitutionally permissible and socially beneficial. The most challenging question came from Patricia Williams, a single mother from Marshall. Governor Abbott, I'm a Christian and I support prayer in schools, but I'm also struggling to make ends meet, and I'm worried about the businesses that are threatening to leave Texas over this issue. How do I balance my faith with my need to feed my family? Abbott felt the weight of her question, understanding that it represented the dilemma facing many working-class conservatives. Ms. Williams, I appreciate your honesty and I understand your concern, but let me ask you this. What kind of Texas do you want your children to grow up in? Do you want them to grow up in a state where economic prosperity comes at the cost of abandoning our values? Or do you want them to grow up in a state where we stand for something greater than just making money? He paused, his voice becoming more personal. I believe, and I've seen this throughout my career, that when we stand firm on our principles, we don't become weaker economically, we become stronger. Businesses want to locate in places where people have strong work ethics, where families are stable, where communities are safe. Those things don't come from government programs, they come from the moral foundation that faith provides. Abbott looked directly at Ms. Williams. I promise you this, any business that would leave Texas because we allow voluntary prayer in schools is not the kind of business that will contribute to our long-term prosperity anyway. The businesses that will make Texas great are the ones that value the same things you value: faith, family, and hard work. After the town hall, Abbott met with local Republican leaders at a nearby restaurant. The mood was tense, with several expressing concern about the political fallout from the initiative. "Governor," said County Judge Robert Martinez, "I support you, but I'm hearing from folks who are worried about the direction of the party. They're saying we're becoming too focused on social issues and not enough on economic growth." Abbott looked around the table at the men and women who had been his political allies for years. "Let me ask you all a question. What made Texas great? Was it just our business-friendly policies? Was it just our natural resources? Or was it the character of our people? The character of our people," replied State Representative Susan Lopez without hesitation. "And where does that character come from?" Abbott pressed. "From our families, our churches, our communities," said Mayor Tom Johnson. "Exactly," Abbott replied. "And what happens when we systematically exclude faith from public life? What happens when we tell our children that God has no place in their education, in their understanding of right and wrong, in their sense of purpose and meaning?" The table fell silent as the group processed Abbott's words. "I'll tell you what happens," Abbott continued. "We raise a generation that doesn't understand the difference between right and wrong, that doesn't have internal moral restraints, that doesn't believe in anything greater than themselves. And then we wonder why we have problems with crime, with addiction, with family breakdown, with mental health crises." He leaned back in his chair, his expression resolute. "I'd rather lose an election fighting for the soul of Texas than win by abandoning the principles that made us great in the first place. And I don't think it's going to come to that. I think the people of Texas are better than the polls suggest." As the evening wound down, Abbott felt cautiously optimistic about the town hall. The questions had been challenging, but the audience had been respectful, and he sensed that his message was resonating with many of them. On the drive back to Austin, Abbott reflected on the conversation with his local supporters. Their concerns were legitimate, but he remained convinced that the prayer initiative was about more than just education policy. It was about the fundamental question of what kind of society America would become. His phone buzzed with a text from Cecilia. "How did it go?" Abbott smiled as he typed back, "Better than expected. The people of Texas are good people. They understand what we're fighting for." As the highway lights flashed past his window, Abbott felt a sense of peace about the path he had chosen. The political battle was far from over, but he was confident that he was fighting for the right cause, in the right way, at the right time. The test of faith wasn't just about whether Texas would allow prayer in schools. It was about whether America would remember the source of its strength and greatness, or whether it would continue drifting toward a secular materialism that had failed every society that had tried it. Abbott was determined to ensure that Texas, at least, would remember. The call came at 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. Abbott was already awake, reviewing briefing materials in his home office when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and Abbott knew immediately that something significant had happened. "Greg, we've got a problem." Patrick's voice was tense. "The Dallas Morning News is running a story tomorrow morning that's going to shake things up. They've got polling data showing that your approval rating has dropped below 50% for the first time in your governorship." Abbott absorbed this information with the stoic calm that had served him through countless political crises. "What are the crosstabs showing? You're still strong in rural areas and with the base, but suburban voters are breaking against us. More concerning, we're losing ground with suburban women and college-educated Republicans. The business community is getting spooked, and some major donors are reconsidering their support." Abbott set down his coffee cup and wheeled over to the window overlooking the Austin skyline. The city was just beginning to wake up, but he knew that by the time most people read their morning news, his political world would be fundamentally changed. "Dan, do you remember what Sam Houston said when he was facing impossible odds at San Jacinto?" Patrick paused, recognizing that Abbott was about to make a point. "Refresh my memory," he said. "The enemy are laughing you to scorn. You must fight like devils to whip them. Sometimes in politics, just like in war, you have to be willing to risk everything to win everything." "Greg, I understand the sentiment, But we're talking about real political consequences here. If we lose the suburbs, we lose the governorship. If we lose the governorship, we lose our ability to advance conservative principles at all. Abbott turned back to his desk, his mind already working through the strategic options. Dan, I need you to be straight with me. Are you having second thoughts about the initiative? There was a long pause before Patrick answered. I'm not having second thoughts about the principle. I'm having second thoughts about the timing and the tactics. Maybe we pushed too hard, too fast, or maybe we didn't push hard enough, Abbott replied. Maybe the problem isn't that we're fighting for prayer in schools. Maybe the problem is that we've been on defense for so long that we've forgotten how to play offense. After hanging up with Patrick, Abbott spent the next hour reviewing the latest polling data and media coverage. The numbers were concerning, but they weren't catastrophic. More importantly, they told a story that Abbott had seen before. When you challenge the established order, there's always an initial backlash. The question was whether you had the courage to weather the storm. At 8 a.m., Abbott convened an emergency meeting of his senior staff. The mood in the conference room was somber, with several staff members looking like they hadn't slept much. Tommy Martinez had dark circles under his eyes, and Maria Gonzalez was unusually quiet. All right, folks, Abbott began. I know everyone's seen the polling numbers, and I know everyone's concerned. But I want to remind you of something. We're not here to chase polls. We're here to lead. Jennifer Walsh, his policy director, raised her hand. Governor, with all due respect, we can't lead if we can't win elections. And right now, we're headed toward a very difficult re-election campaign. Abbott nodded, appreciating her candor. Jennifer, you're right that we need to be electable. But let me ask you this, what's the point of being electable if we're not willing to use that electability to advance our principles? He looked around the table at his team. I've been thinking about this all morning, and I've come to a conclusion. We're not backing down from the prayer initiative. In fact, we're going to double down on it. The room fell silent. Maria Gonzalez was the first to speak. Governor, what do you mean by double down? Abbott leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him such a formidable political leader. I mean, we're going to make this a statewide referendum on the role of faith in public life. We're going to force every candidate for state office to take a position on this issue. We're going to make it clear that this election is about more than just politics. It's about the soul of Texas. Tommy Martinez looked nervous. Sir, that's a huge risk. If we make this a referendum and we lose, it could set back the conservative movement for years. And if we back down now, Abbott replied, we'll prove that we don't really believe what we claim to believe. We'll show that we're just another group of politicians who will abandon their principles the moment it becomes politically inconvenient. The meeting continued for another hour, with Abbott outlining his strategy for the months ahead. He would travel to every corner of Texas, holding town halls and speaking at churches, explaining his vision for a state that honored both religious freedom and traditional values. He would challenge his opponents to explain why they thought acknowledging God in public life was dangerous to democracy. That afternoon, Abbott held a press conference in the Capitol Rotunda, with the dome soaring above him and the Texas flag prominently displayed behind the podium. The room was packed with reporters, many of whom had traveled from national news organizations to cover what they saw. As a defining moment in Texas politics, ladies and gentlemen, Abbott began, his voice carrying clearly through the rotunda. I want to address the speculation about the future of our prayer initiative. Let me be crystal clear. We are not backing down. We are not compromising. We are not retreating. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I've been in politics for over 30 years, and I've learned that there are moments when you have to decide what you really believe. This is one of those moments. Do we believe that acknowledging God in public life is good for our children and our communities? Or do we believe that faith should be relegated to the private sphere, while secular ideologies dominate public discourse? A reporter from the Houston Chronicle raised her hand. Governor, your approval ratings are at their lowest point since you took office. Are you concerned that this initiative is damaging your political standing? Abbott smiled. Slightly, Sarah. I've never been in politics for the approval ratings. I've been in politics to make a difference. And sometimes making a difference requires taking stands that are initially unpopular. Another reporter pressed, "But Governor, several major corporations have expressed concerns about the initiative. Are you worried about the economic impact?" "I'm worried about the moral impact of a society that puts corporate opinions ahead of fundamental principles," Abbott replied. "I'm worried about raising a generation of young people who think that their highest purpose is to serve corporate interests rather than to serve God and their fellow human beings." The questions continued for 30 minutes, with Abbott facing challenges from multiple directions. But throughout it all, he maintained his central message that the prayer initiative was about more than education policy. It was about the fundamental question of what kind of society America would become. After the press conference, Abbott returned to his office to find his daughter Audrey waiting for him. She had driven down from Dallas, where she worked as a marketing executive, and her expression was a mixture of concern and admiration. "Dad, I watched the press conference. You know I support you, but I'm worried about what this is costing you personally." Abbott gestured for her to sit down, then moved his wheelchair closer to her chair. "Audrey, do you remember when you were little and you asked me why God let me get hurt in that accident?" "Of course I remember. And do you remember what I told you?" Audrey smiled slightly. "You said that sometimes God allows difficult things to happen because He has a bigger plan that we can't see yet." "That's right. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Maybe everything I've been through, the accident, the years of fighting legal battles, the political campaigns, maybe it was all preparing me for this moment." He reached over and took her hand. "Audrey, I may lose this fight. I may lose the next election, but I'll never lose the knowledge that I stood for something that mattered, that I fought for principles that are bigger than my own political career." Audrey squeezed his hand. "Dad, I'm proud of you. But promise me you won't let this destroy everything else you've built." "I promise you that I'll always put family first," Abbott replied. "But I also promise you that I'll never stop fighting for the values that made our family and our state strong." That evening, Abbott sat in his study at the governor's mansion, reviewing the day's events and preparing for the battles ahead. The political risks were enormous, but he felt a sense of peace about the path he had chosen. His phone buzzed with a text from Rick Perry. "Saw your press conference. Proud of you, brother. Stay strong." Abbott smiled, grateful for the support of his old friend and mentor. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for the fight. The special session of the Texas legislature began on a crisp November morning, with protesters from both sides filling the Capitol grounds. Abbott had called the session specifically to address the prayer initiative, forcing lawmakers to take a clear vote on the issue rather than allowing it to die in committee. The political stakes couldn't have been higher. Inside the Capitol, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Abbott sat in the gallery overlooking the House floor, watching as legislators filed in for what everyone knew would be a historic vote. The initiative had been refined after months of debate, but its core remained unchanged. Texas public schools would be required to provide time for voluntary prayer and moments of reflection. Speaker of the House Dade Phelan called the session to order, his expression grave. "Members, we're here today to consider legislation that has generated more public interest than any bill in recent memory. This is about more than policy, it's about the values that define us as Texans." The debate began with State Representative James White of Hillister, a strong supporter of the initiative. "Mr. Speaker, this legislation is about restoring something that was taken from us, the right to acknowledge God. In our public institutions, we're not forcing anyone to pray. We're simply saying that those who want to pray shouldn't be prevented from doing so." Representative White was followed by Representative Donna Howard of Austin, one of the initiative's strongest critics. "Mr. Speaker, this legislation violates the fundamental principle of separation of church and state. It puts government in the business of promoting religion, which is exactly what the First Amendment was designed to prevent." Abbott listened to the debate with the intense focus of a lawyer analyzing legal arguments. He had heard these positions many times before, but the stakes of this particular debate were unprecedented. If the initiative failed in the legislature, it would be a devastating blow to his political authority and his broader vision for Texas. The debate continued for 3 hours, With passionate speeches on both sides, Abbott was particularly struck by the words of Representative Tony Tinderholt of Arlington, who had been one of the initiative's earliest supporters. "Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about something that's been lost in all the political rhetoric. I want to talk about why this matters to real families in real communities. In my district, I see young people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, and a sense of meaninglessness. They've been told that they're just highly evolved animals with no purpose, beyond their own pleasure and survival. Is it any wonder that they're struggling?" Tinderholt's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "This initiative isn't about imposing religion on anyone. It's about giving young people the opportunity to connect with something greater than themselves, to understand that they have a purpose and a destiny that goes beyond the material world." The opposition response came from Representative Julie Johnson of Dallas, who had emerged as one of the initiative's most articulate critics. "Representative Tinderholt, I understand your concerns about young people, but the solution isn't to have government promote religion. The solution is to strengthen families, communities, and mental health services." Abbott felt his jaw tighten as he listened to Representative Johnson's words. The argument that social problems could be solved through government programs rather than moral renewal was exactly the kind of thinking that had led to the current crisis. The crucial moment came when Representative Lyle Larson of San Antonio, a moderate Republican who had been undecided, stood to speak. Larson's vote was seen as indicative of how other suburban Republicans would vote, and his words would likely influence the final tally. "Mr. Speaker, I've wrestled with this issue for months. I respect the governor's convictions, and I share his concerns about the moral foundation of our society. But I also represent a diverse district with families of many different faiths and backgrounds." Abbott leaned forward, knowing that Larson's next words could determine the fate of the initiative. After much prayer and reflection, Larson continued, "I've concluded that this legislation, as written, goes too far. I cannot support government-mandated prayer time in public schools, even if it's voluntary. I believe there are other ways to support religious freedom without crossing the line into government endorsement of religion." Abbott felt his heart sink as Larson announced his opposition. The moderate Republican's defection would likely bring others with him, potentially dooming the initiative. The final vote was called at 4:30 p.m. After nearly 8 hours of debate, Abbott watched from the gallery as the electronic voting board lit up with red and green lights. The tension in the chamber was palpable as members cast their votes. When the voting closed, Speaker Felon announced the results. The final vote is 76 in favor, 70 for opposed. The bill passes. The chamber erupted in cheers and boos, with supporters of the initiative celebrating while opponents shook their heads in dismay. Abbott felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that the real battle was just beginning. After the vote, Abbott met with key supporters in his Capitol office. The mood was celebratory, but Abbott remained focused on the challenges ahead. "Governor," said Representative White, "we did it. We actually did it." Abbott nodded, but his expression remained serious. "James, we won the legislative battle, but the war is just beginning. The opposition is going to challenge this in federal court, and we need to be ready for that fight." Lieutenant Governor Patrick, who had been instrumental in shepherding the bill through the Senate, raised a concern. "Greg, we're going to face a massive mobilization effort from the other side. They're going to use this vote to energize their base and raise millions of dollars." "Good," Abbott replied. "Let them mobilize. Let them raise money. Let them make this election about whether Texas is going to stand for its values or bow to pressure from coastal elites and corporate interests." The meeting continued for another hour, with Abbott outlining his strategy for defending the initiative in court and using it as a rallying point for conservative voters. He was confident that the legal challenges could be overcome, but he was also realistic about the political challenges ahead. That evening, Abbott addressed the state through a televised speech from his office. The cameras captured him against the backdrop of the Texas flag, his expression resolute but not triumphant. "My fellow Texans," he began, "today the legislature took a historic step in defense of religious freedom and traditional values, but I want to be clear about what this legislation does and doesn't do." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the conversational tone that had made him an effective communicator. This law doesn't force anyone to pray. It doesn't favor any particular religion. It simply says that students who want to begin their day with prayer or reflection should have that opportunity. Abbott paused, looking directly into the camera. But this vote was about more than just prayer in schools. It was about whether Texas is going to remember the source of its strength and greatness, or whether we're going to follow the path of other states that have abandoned their moral foundations. He concluded with words that would define his governorship. I believe that without prayer, we cannot be a strong nation. I believe that without acknowledging God in public life, we lose the very foundation that makes freedom possible. And I believe that Texas will always be a state where faith, family, and freedom are celebrated, not hidden. The speech was watched by over 2 million Texans, generating immediate reactions across the political spectrum. Conservative supporters praised Abbott's courage and conviction, while liberal critics condemned what they saw as government overreach and religious extremism. But Abbott was focused on a different audience, the millions of Texans who shared his values, but had been silent in the face of cultural and political pressure. He believed that the prayer initiative would give them a reason to engage in the political process and to stand up for their beliefs. As he prepared for bed that night, Abbott reflected on the day's events. The legislative victory was significant, but he knew that the real test would come in the months ahead. As the initiative faced legal challenges and political opposition, his wife Cecilia joined him in their bedroom, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. Greg, I'm proud of what you accomplished today, but I'm also worried about what comes next. Abbott took her hand. Cecilia, I won't lie to you. The next few months are going to be difficult, but I truly believe that this is what God has called me to do, and I believe that if we stand firm on our principles, we'll emerge stronger than ever. 6 months after the prayer initiative became law, Abbott stood before a packed auditorium at Baylor University, delivering what many considered the defining speech of his political career. The legal challenges had been largely unsuccessful, with federal courts ruling that the voluntary nature of the prayer time met constitutional requirements. More importantly, the political fallout had been far less severe than critics had predicted. The November elections had been a vindication of Abbott's strategy. Despite dire predictions from pollsters and political consultants, Abbott had won re-election by a comfortable margin, carrying not only his traditional rural base, but also performing better than expected in suburban areas. The prayer initiative had mobilized conservative voters, while not driving away as many moderates as feared: students, faculty, and fellow Texans. Abbott began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium. I want to talk to you today about something that goes to the heart of who we are as Americans and as Texans. I want to talk about the relationship between faith and freedom. In the audience sat many of the people who had been part of his journey over the past year: Maria Gonzalez, Tommy Martinez, Jennifer Walsh, and other staff members who had stood with him through the political storms. Also present were former opponents who had come to respect his conviction, even if they disagreed with his positions. A year ago, when we began this fight for prayer in schools, many people told me it was political suicide. They said that Americans no longer wanted to acknowledge God in public life, that the country had moved beyond its religious foundations, that faith was a private matter with no place in public discourse. Abbott paused, his eyes scanning the audience. But I believed then, and I believe now, that those people were wrong. Not because I'm a particularly wise politician, but because I understand something fundamental about the American character. We are a people who have always understood that our rights come from God, not from government. He gestured toward the American flag that stood at the side of the stage. Every principle we hold dear: the dignity of human life, the importance of individual liberty, the concept of justice. These didn't emerge from secular philosophy. They came from centuries of religious thought and practice, from the understanding that we are created in the image of God and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. A student in the front row raised her hand, and Abbott recognized her. Governor, what would you say to those who argue that acknowledging God in public life is divisive? and excludes people of different faiths or no faith. Abbott smiled, appreciating the thoughtful question. That's an excellent question, and it goes to the heart of what religious freedom really means. True religious freedom isn't about creating a secular public space where no one can acknowledge God. True religious freedom is about creating a space where people of all faiths or no faith can participate as equals. He leaned forward slightly. When we acknowledge God in public life, we're not saying that everyone has to believe the same thing. We're saying that the vast majority of Americans do believe in God, and that those beliefs have shaped our history, our culture, and our understanding of human dignity and rights. The speech continued for 45 minutes, with Abbott weaving together themes of faith, freedom, and civic responsibility. He spoke about the importance of moral education, the role of religious institutions in strengthening communities, and the need for public leaders to stand for principles that transcended political expediency. Let me conclude with a story, Abbott said as he neared the end of his remarks. 26 years ago, I was a young man with big dreams and ambitious plans. I was running through a neighborhood in Houston when a tree fell on me, leaving me paralyzed from the waist down. In that moment, I could have chosen to become bitter, to blame God for my circumstances, to abandon my faith and my hope for the future. The auditorium was completely silent, with many students hearing this personal story for the first time. Instead, I chose to believe that God had a plan for my life, that my accident was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter. I chose to believe that God could use even the worst circumstances for good purposes, that my struggles could become a source of strength for others facing their own challenges. Abbott's voice grew stronger as he continued. That's what the prayer initiative has always been about. It's not about forcing anyone to believe what I believe. It's about giving our young people the opportunity to understand that their struggles, whatever they are not bigger than God. It's about helping them discover that they have a purpose and a destiny that goes beyond the material world. He concluded with words that would be remembered long after the political battles were forgotten. My fellow Texans, my fellow Americans, I want you to know that without prayer, we cannot be a strong nation. Without acknowledging God in public life, we lose the very foundation that makes freedom possible. And without passing these truths on to the next generation, we fail in our most sacred duty as parents, as educators, and as citizens. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes, with students and faculty members from across the political spectrum rising to their feet. Abbott had not convinced everyone, but he had earned their respect for his conviction and his courage. After the speech, Abbott met privately with a small group of students who had requested time to discuss the prayer initiative and its implications. The conversation was respectful but challenging, with students asking tough questions about the relationship between faith and government. "Governor," said Sarah Martinez, a senior political science major, "I admire your conviction, but I'm still concerned about the potential for this initiative to make some students feel excluded or uncomfortable. How do we ensure that voluntary really means voluntary?" Abbott nodded, understanding the genuine concern behind the question. "Sarah, that's exactly the right question to ask, and it's why implementation is so crucial. Teachers and administrators need to be trained to ensure that no student ever feels pressured to participate or excluded for not participating. This has to be about inclusion, not exclusion." Another student, David Kim, raised his hand. "Governor, you've talked about the importance of faith in American history, but what about the role of reason and science? How do we balance religious beliefs with empirical knowledge?" Abbott smiled, recognizing an intelligent challenge. "David, I don't see any conflict between faith and reason, between religious belief and scientific inquiry. Some of the greatest scientists in history have been deeply religious people who saw their work as exploring the wonders of God's creation. Faith and reason aren't enemies, they're partners in the search for truth." The conversation continued for another hour, with Abbott answering questions about everything from the constitutional implications of the initiative to its practical effects on classroom instruction. Throughout it all, he maintained his core message that acknowledging God in public life was not about imposing beliefs but about recognizing the source of America's strength and greatness. As the evening concluded, Abbott reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The prayer initiative had been more than just a policy battle, it had been a test of whether he was willing to stand for his deepest convictions. Regardless of the political consequences, the initiative had survived legal challenges, political opposition, and media criticism. More importantly, it had sparked a broader conversation about the role of faith in American life and the importance of moral education in shaping young people's character. 6 months after implementation, preliminary reports showed that the initiative was working as intended. Students who chose to participate in prayer time reported feeling more centered and focused, while those who chose not to participate were being respected for their decision. There had been no significant incidents of coercion or exclusion, and the feared exodus of businesses from Texas had not materialized. As Abbott prepared to leave Baylor University, he was approached by Dr. Linda Livingstone, the university's president. "Governor, thank you for your courage in defending religious freedom. You've shown that it's possible to stand for principles even when it's politically difficult." Abbott smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction about the path he had chosen. "Dr. Livingstone, I've learned that the hardest battles are often the most important ones. If we're not willing to fight for our deepest convictions, then we're not really fighting for anything at all." The drive back to Austin gave Abbott time to reflect on the broader implications of the prayer initiative. It had become a model for other states grappling with similar issues, and several governors had contacted him about implementing similar programs in their states. More importantly, it had demonstrated that American voters were still capable of supporting leaders who stood for principle over political expediency. The initiative had been controversial, but it had also been successful, showing that faith and freedom could coexist in American public life. As Abbott arrived at the governor's mansion, he found Cecilia waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a smile. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected," Abbott replied. The students asked tough questions, but they were respectful and genuinely interested in understanding the issues. Cecilia settled into the chair across from him. "Greg, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished, not just politically, but personally. You've shown that it's possible to stand for your beliefs without compromising your integrity." Abbott took her hand, feeling grateful for her support throughout the challenging year. "Cecilia, I couldn't have done any of this without you. Your strength and wisdom have been my foundation through all of this." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Abbott reflected on the legacy he hoped to leave. The prayer initiative would be remembered as a significant policy achievement, but he hoped it would also be remembered as evidence that American leaders could still find the courage to defend their deepest convictions. The inscription on his desk, a gift from his daughter Audrey, captured his philosophy. "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." Abbott had faced his moment of challenge and controversy, and he had chosen to stand firm on his principles. The prayer initiative had become law, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle to preserve America's moral and spiritual foundations. As he prepared for bed, Abbott offered a quiet prayer of gratitude for the opportunity to serve and for the strength to stand for what he believed was right. The political battles would continue, but he was confident that he had fought the good fight and kept the faith. The prayer initiative had been about more than just education policy. It had been about the soul of America, and in defending it, Abbott had demonstrated that the soul of America was still worth fighting for.